Man rescues a bear cub, but what the mother does next will shock you. One foggy morning in the wilderness of Montana, John Carter, a retired forest ranger living alone in a cabin, heard a heart-wrenching cry echoing from the cliffs near the waterfall. He paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips, his weathered face creasing with concern. The sound came again, high-pitched and desperate, carrying through the mist that clung to the pines outside his window. John set his mug down on the rough-hewn table and reached for his jacket. 28 years as a forest ranger had taught him to recognize distress calls, and whatever was making that sound needed help. He grabbed his walking stick, oak, polished smooth from years of use, and headed out the door. The fog hung thick between the trees as John made his way toward the waterfall. It was early May, and the forest was coming alive after a long winter. The ground was soft underfoot, still damp from the previous night's rain. He followed an old familiar trail before veering off toward the sound, which grew more urgent with each passing minute. "I'm coming," he muttered, though he knew whatever creature was in trouble couldn't understand him. The words were more for his own benefit, a habit he'd developed during his years of solitude. 3 years since retirement, 5 since Claire had passed. These days, the sound of his own voice was sometimes the only thing that kept the silence at bay. The trail grew steeper as he approached the ravine. The waterfall's roar grew louder, mingling with the desperate cries. John moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The rain had made the ground treacherous, and at 62, he couldn't afford a fall, not out here, not alone. He reached the edge of the ravine and peered down. Through the swirling mist, he could make out the churning waters of the creek, swollen from the spring rains, cascading over rocks worn smooth by centuries of rushing water. And there, trapped between 2 slabs of rock at the edge of the waterfall, was a bear cub. John's breath caught in his throat. The cub's front leg was wedged tight between the rocks, and it was struggling frantically to free itself. The water level was rising quickly, already lapping at the cub's belly. If it rose much higher, without hesitation, John began making his way down the steep slope of the ravine, using his walking stick for balance. He'd worked with wildlife his entire career, but bears were always unpredictable, especially when their young were threatened. "Where's your mama?" he muttered, scanning the surrounding area for signs of an adult bear. The last thing he needed was to be caught between a mother bear and her cub. The descent was treacherous. Twice he nearly lost his footing on the slick rocks. The cub spotted him and redoubled its efforts to escape, its cries growing more frantic. "Easy there," John called softly. "I'm here to help." He was just 10 feet from the trapped cub when he heard it, a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the misty air. John froze, then slowly turned. There, on the opposite side of the ravine, stood a massive female grizzly. Her fur was wet and matted from the rain, and her eyes blazed with a fierce, protective fire. The mother bear rose up on her hind legs, towering nearly 8 feet tall, and let out a roar that echoed through the ravine. John's hand instinctively went to his hip, but he'd left his sidearm at the cabin. He'd never expected to need it on a morning walk. Cursing under his breath, he calculated his options. He couldn't outrun the bear, not up that steep slope, and he couldn't leave the cub to drown. "Easy now, May," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "I'm just trying to help your little one." The mother bear dropped back to all fours and began pacing on her side of the ravine, agitated but seemingly unsure how to reach her cub through the rushing water. The cub cried out again, and John could see the water had risen to its chest. He had to act. Moving slowly, keeping one eye on the mother bear, John edged closer to the trapped cub. The rocks were slippery beneath his boots, and the roar of the waterfall was deafening now. He was just a few feet away when it happened. A rock, loosened by the rain and the vibration of his footsteps, gave way beneath him. John felt his ankle twist as he went down, and then a searing pain shot up his leg as a boulder tumbled down, pinning his leg against the rocky ground. He cried out, more in surprise than pain, though that came a moment later, sharp and insistent. The mother bear's head snapped toward him, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. John looked into her eyes, deep brown, intelligent, and filled with something he couldn't quite name. Fear, certainly, and anger, but something else too. Something almost human. Then, to John's astonishment, the bear turned away from him. She lumbered toward her cub, stepping carefully through the shallow edges of the surging creek. The cub cried out to her, struggling more desperately now as the water continued to rise. John watched, transfixed, as the mother bear approached the rock that trapped her cub. With a strength that left him in awe, she dug her massive paws into the crevice and began to push. The rock moved, just slightly at first, then more, as she put her full weight behind it. The cub's leg came free. But in that same instant, the little creature lost its balance. It tumbled backward toward the edge of the waterfall, its small paws scrabbling for purchase on the slick rock. Without thinking, John lunged forward, ignoring the pain that shot through his pinned leg. He stretched out his arms and caught the cub as it slid past him, his fingers closing around its wet fur. The cub squirmed in his grasp, but he held firm, pulling it away from the deadly drop. "I've got you," he gasped, cradling the trembling creature against his chest. "I've got you." The mother bear turned, and John tensed, waiting for the attack that would surely come. But it didn't. Instead, the massive creature lumbered toward him, her movements cautious but purposeful. She stopped just a few feet away, her breath visible in the cool morning air. John held perfectly still, the cub clutched against him. The mother bear lowered her head, sniffing, her eyes never leaving his. Then, to his utter disbelief, she moved to the boulder that pinned his leg and began to push. The pain was excruciating as the pressure eased and blood rushed back into his crushed limb. John bit back a cry, not wanting to startle the bear. With a final shove, the boulder rolled away, splashing into the creek. John sat up slowly, still holding the cub. His leg throbbed, but he could move it, nothing broken, it seemed, though he'd have one hell of a bruise. The mother bear watched him, her massive head tilted slightly to one side. John held out the cub, offering it back to her. "Here you go," he said softly. "Take your beam." The cub squirmed out of his grasp and half-limped, half-scrambled to its mother. The female bear nuzzled it gently, checking it over as if for injuries. Then she looked at John once more, her gaze steady and unafraid. For a long moment they stared at each other, man and bear, connected by something John couldn't explain. Then, with a soft grunt, the mother bear turned and led her cub away, disappearing into the mist that still clung to the trees. John sat there for a long time, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had the bear really helped him, or was it just trying to get to the rock and he'd been in the way? No, he was certain. The bear had deliberately moved the boulder off his leg. With a groan, he pulled himself to his feet, testing his weight on his injured leg. It hurt, but it would hold. Using his walking stick for support, he began the slow climb back up the ravine. By the time he reached his cabin, the fog had lifted, and the morning sun was streaming through the trees. John cleaned and bandaged his leg, then sat on his porch with a fresh cup of coffee, staring out at the forest, wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. He hadn't told anyone about the incident. Who would believe him? A bear that didn't attack, that seemed to understand he was helping her cub, that had even helped him in return? They'd think he was going senile, a lonely old man making up stories. But he knew what he'd seen, what he'd felt in that moment when their eyes met. It was something he'd carry with him for the rest of his days. A week passed, and John's leg healed well enough that he could walk without much of a limp. He returned to his usual routines, chopping wood, tending his small garden, making his daily circuit of the forest paths near his cabin. He saw no sign of the bear or her cub, and he began to wonder if they had moved on to another part of the forest. Then one morning, he opened his door to find something strange on his porch. A small, smooth branch about the length of his forearm lay on the weathered boards. It had been stripped of its bark and polished smooth, almost as if someone had worked it deliberately. John picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was oddly regular, with none of the knots or irregularities you'd expect to find in a branch that had fallen naturally. The ends were smooth, not jagged, where they'd broken from a tree. "What the hell?" he muttered, scanning the tree-line for any sign of visitors. But there was no one there and no tracks in the soft earth around his cabin, save for his own. He brought the branch inside, setting it on his mantel above the fireplace. Probably just a coincidence, he told himself. Maybe a tree had fallen nearby and this branch had somehow ended up on his porch. But 2 days later, there was something else, a perfectly round stone, polished smooth as glass, placed precisely in the center of his welcome mat. And the day after that, a small pile of wild berries arranged in a neat circle. John began to watch more carefully. He set up his old trail camera, positioning it to capture the approach to his porch. For 3 days, nothing appeared. Then, on the 4th morning, he found another gift, a cluster of wild flowers, stems carefully woven together. He checked the camera, heart pounding with anticipation. The images showed a large female bear, the same one he'd encountered at the waterfall, approaching his cabin in the pre-dawn light. In her mouth, she carried the flowers. She placed them gently on the porch, then sat back on her haunches, staring at the cabin for a long moment before turning and lumbering back into the forest. John sank into his porch chair, the camera clutched in his trembling hands. It wasn't possible. Bears didn't bring gifts. They didn't remember kindnesses or repay debts. And yet, there was the proof, captured in grainy black and white. The gifts continued throughout the summer, small, carefully chosen items, interesting rocks, polished sticks, the occasional bunch of berries or flowers. John began to leave his own offerings in return, honey in a shallow dish, fresh apples from the tree behind his cabin. They were always gone by morning. Sometimes, on his walks through the forest, he would catch glimpses of the bear and her cub, watching him from a distance. They never approached, and he never tried to get closer. It was enough to know they were there, that this strange connection between them was real. He still told no one. His nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and he rarely went into town except for supplies. There was no one to tell, no one who would understand the quiet miracle unfolding in his life. Then autumn came, painting the forest in shades of gold and crimson. The air grew cooler, and John began preparing for the long winter ahead. He split and stacked firewood, laid in supplies, checked and rechecked his generator. The bears would be preparing for hibernation, he knew. Soon they would disappear into whatever den the mother had prepared, sleeping away the cold months until spring returned. The thought left him with an unexpected sense of loss. He'd grown accustomed to the small gifts, to the occasional glimpses of his unlikely friends. Winter had always been the hardest season for John, the isolation pressing in on him like the snow that would soon blanket his little corner of the wilderness. This year, he suspected, would be harder still. The first snow fell in late October, just a light dusting that melted by noon, but it was a harbinger of what was to come. John saw no sign of the bears and no more gifts appeared on his porch. They've gone to ground, he thought. Smart. The weather reports were predicting a harsh winter. November brought the first real storm, howling winds, driving snow against his windows like handfuls of thrown rice. John sat by his fire, a book open but unread in his lap, listening to the wind and thinking of the bears, tucked away in their den, warm and safe. The storm raged for 3 days. By the time it passed, nearly 2 feet of snow covered the ground, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and new. John spent the morning clearing a path from his door to the woodpile and checking his solar panels for damage. He was just finishing when he heard a sound so out of place that at first he wasn't sure he had heard it at all, a knock. 3 distinct raps against his front door. John froze, snow shovel in hand. There was no way anyone could have made it up to his cabin in this weather. The road was impassable, and even the Forest Service wouldn't attempt it without good reason. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Slowly, John set down his shovel and made his way to the door. His hand hesitated on the knob, a strange apprehension filling him. Then, drawing a deep breath, he pulled it open. The mother bear stood on his porch, her massive body trembling, thick with snow. Behind her, huddled together for warmth, were 2 cubs, one he recognized from the waterfall, now considerably larger, and a smaller one he'd never seen before. The smaller cub was convulsing, its breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long moment, John and the bear stared at each other. In her dark eyes, he saw something that transcended the barriers between their species, a desperate plea, a trust that defied explanation. Without hesitation, John stepped back from the door. "Bring them in," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll help." The mother bear seemed to understand. She nudged her cubs forward, guiding them into the warmth of the cabin. John moved quickly, his mind racing. The shed, he thought, it was attached to the back of the cabin, insulated but separate from his living space. There was a wood stove out there that he used for projects during the winter. "This way," he said, moving toward the door that connected to the shed. The bear followed, her cubs stumbling alongside her. The shed was cold, but it wouldn't be for long. John lit the stove, feeding it with the driest wood he had, then spread tarps on the floor to provide some insulation from the cold concrete. He filled a basin with warm water and set it nearby, then retreated to the doorway. The mother bear guided her cubs to the tarps, curling her massive body around them. The larger cub seemed all right, just cold and exhausted from the journey, but the smaller one was clearly unwell, its breathing labored, its small body racked with tremors. John stood watching, one hand resting close to the rifle he kept mounted by the door, not that he thought he'd need it, not anymore, but old habits died hard. The mother bear caught his eye, and in that look was a profound understanding, a recognition of the risk she was taking, bringing her cubs into a human dwelling. "I'll do what I can," John promised. Over the next 3 days, as another storm raged outside, John tended to the bears as best he could. He kept the stove burning, brought fresh water, and even managed to coax the smaller cub into drinking a mixture of honey and warm water that his grandfather had once used for sick livestock. The mother bear watched his every move but made no aggressive gestures. She seemed to understand he was trying to help. On the fourth day, the storm finally broke, and weak winter sunlight filtered through the shed's small window. The smaller cub was much improved, playing with its sibling on the tarps while the mother rested nearby. John stood in the doorway, a cup of coffee warming his hands, watching the scene with a sense of wonder. Where in all his years as a ranger had he experienced anything like this? It defied everything he knew about wild animals, about the natural order of things. That evening, as the sun was setting, the mother bear rose to her feet. Her cubs scrambled up, suddenly alert. She turned to John, who sat on a stool by the stove, and made a soft huffing sound. "Time to go, huh?" he said, setting aside his coffee. He opened the shed door, letting in a blast of cold air. Outside, the world was white and still, the storm's fury replaced by a pristine calm. The mother bear led her cubs to the door, pausing to look back at John. He could have sworn there was gratitude in her gaze, a connection that transcended the boundaries between their species. "You're welcome," he said softly. "Anytime." The bears disappeared into the twilight, their dark shapes soon swallowed by the shadows beneath the trees. John stood in the doorway long after they'd gone, something tight and warm unfurling in his chest that night. He slept better than he had in years. Winter settled in earnest over the Montana wilderness. Snow piled high around John's cabin and the temperatures plummeted. He saw no sign of the bears, but he hadn't expected to. They would be deep in hibernation now, the mother's body keeping her cubs warm through the long, cold months. John found himself thinking of them often as he went about his solitary routines, chopping wood, clearing snow, making small repairs to his cabin. All the while, his mind would drift to the mother bear's intelligent eyes, to the soft fur of the cubs, to the inexplicable bond that had formed between them. In January, a package arrived with his monthly supply delivery, a rare occurrence, as few people sent him mail these days. Inside was a book on bear behavior with a note from a former colleague. "Thought you might find this interesting. Happy New Year, old friend." John read the book cover to cover, searching for some explanation for what he'd experienced. There were accounts of unusual interactions between bears and humans, anecdotes that stretched the boundaries of conventional understanding, but nothing like his story. Nothing that could explain the gifts, the apparent gratitude, the desperate trust that had led the mother bear to bring her sick cub to his door. Perhaps, he thought, closing the book late one night, some things defied scientific explanation. Perhaps there were connections in this world that went deeper than biology or instinct, that touched on something more profound. February brought more snow and bitter cold. John's supplies began to run low, but the pass was too treacherous for the monthly delivery. He rationed what he had, confident he could last until the weather broke. He'd survived worse winters, after all. Then, one morning in early March, he found something on his porch that made his heart skip a beat, a freshly killed rabbit, laid out neatly on the welcome mat. Beside it was a smooth stone, similar to the ones the mother bear had brought him the previous summer. John stared at the offerings, a lump forming in his throat. The bears should still be hibernating. It was too early for them to be active. Had the mother woken early? Had she sensed somehow that he was running low on food? Impossible, he told himself, and yet there was the rabbit, still warm, and the stone, a gift. He recognized it. He brought the rabbit inside and prepared it for stew, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of skinning and butchering while his mind grappled with the implications. If the mother bear was awake and bringing him food, Did that mean her cubs were all right? Had they survived the harsh winter? The stew simmered on his stove, filling the cabin with savory aromas that made his stomach growl. John sat at his table, the stone from the porch placed before him like a talisman. Outside, the late winter sun glinted off the snow, creating a world of blinding white and deep blue shadows. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the snow was retreating, revealing patches of earth and the first tender shoots of new growth. John began venturing further from his cabin, checking the Forest Service trails for winter damage, clearing fallen trees, preparing for the season ahead. He found himself watching for signs of the bears, though he knew it was still early. Most bears wouldn't emerge from hibernation until April at the earliest. Still, he couldn't shake the memory of that rabbit on his porch, the stone placed beside it with what seemed like deliberate care. April arrived with a riot of wildflowers and birdsong. The forest came alive again, shaking off the long silence of winter. John spent more time outdoors, his spirit lifting with the lengthening days and warming temperatures. Then, one golden morning in late April, as John sat on his porch with his coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, he saw them. 3 dark shapes emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing, the mother bear, massive and sleek after her winter rest, and her 2 cubs, now nearly half her size. They paused at the tree-line, the mother's nose lifting to test the air. John held perfectly still, his coffee forgotten in his hands. The mother bear's gaze found him, and even across the distance, he felt the connection between them, that inexplicable bond forged in crisis and deepened through trust. Slowly, with deliberate steps, the mother bear began to approach the cabin. Her cubs followed, staying close to her flanks but showing none of the fear he might have expected. They crossed the clearing with unhurried grace, stopping about 20 yards from the porch. The mother bear made a soft huffing sound, and the cubs sat back on their haunches, waiting. Then, to John's astonishment, she continued forward alone. He should have been afraid. Any sane person would be with a full-grown grizzly approaching their home, but John felt no fear, only a sense of anticipation, of something momentous about to occur. The mother bear stopped at the foot of the porch steps, looking up at him with those intelligent eyes. For a long moment they regarded each other in silence. Then, with a movement so gentle it seemed almost tentative, she placed her massive paw on the bottom step. John set his coffee mug aside and slowly rose to his feet. "Hello, old friend," he said softly. The bear took another step up, then another, until she stood on the porch just a few feet away from him. John could smell her wild scent, could see the sun glinting off her thick fur, could hear the deep rumble of her breathing. Then, with a grace that belied her size, the mother bear lowered her head and gently, so gently, pressed her forehead against John's belly. The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent a jolt through John's entire being, a connection so profound, so utterly unexpected, that he felt tears spring to his eyes. The bear stepped back, regarding him once more, then turned and lumbered back down the steps. She rejoined her cubs, nudging them forward a few steps as if wanting John to see them clearly, to see how they had grown, how they had survived the winter. The larger cub, the one he'd rescued from the waterfall nearly a year ago, sat up on its hind legs, mirroring a gesture it had seen its mother make. The mother bear made another soft sound, and the cubs settled back on all fours. Then, to John's further amazement, she reached up and pulled something from her mouth, a long branch, carefully stripped of bark and smooth at one end. With deliberate movements, she laid it at the edge of the clearing, then stepped back, her eyes on John, hardly daring to breathe. John descended the porch steps and crossed the yard. The bears watched him unmoving as he bent to pick up the branch. It wasn't just a branch, he realized, turning it over in his trembling hands. It had been worked, the end shaped into a crude but recognizable handle, the length straightened and smooth. The walking stick, far more substantial than his old one. He looked up, speechless, to find the mother bear watching him intently. Had she made this? Had she somehow understood the purpose of his walking stick and created one for him? It seemed impossible, and yet the evidence was in his hands. "Thank you, Tayosi," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you." The mother bear made a soft huffing sound, then slowly turned and led her cubs back toward the forest. At the edge of the trees, she paused, looking back at John one last time. Then they were gone, swallowed by the shadows beneath the pines. John stood in the clearing for a long time, the walking stick clutched in his hands, tears streaming unheeded down his weathered cheeks. In all his years in the wilderness, in all his encounters with the natural world, nothing had prepared him for this, for the profound connection he'd forged with a creature so different from himself, yet capable of understanding, of gratitude, of something that could only be called friendship. A week later, a letter arrived with his monthly supplies. John recognized the handwriting immediately, though he hadn't seen it in nearly 2 years. Emily, his daughter. Their relationship had grown strained after Claire's death. Emily had wanted him to move closer to her in Seattle, to leave behind the isolated cabin that held so many memories of her mother. John had refused, unable to imagine living anywhere but the wilderness that had been his home for most of his adult life. Words had been spoken in grief and anger, and then a silence had fallen between them, broken only by the occasional holiday card or brief phone call. John sat on his porch, turning the envelope over in his hands, suddenly nervous. What could have prompted her to write now, after all this time? Finally, he opened it, unfolding the pages with careful fingers. "Dear Dad," it began. "I saw the most amazing thing last week. I was browsing online and came across an article about a man in Montana who had formed an unusual bond with a family of bears. There was a photo of the man sitting on his porch, a beautifully carved walking stick in his hands. It was you, Dad. I'd know your face anywhere." John's breath caught. Someone had seen, someone had photographed him without his knowledge. He read on, his heart pounding. The article talked about how you had rescued a bear cub last spring, how the mother bear had helped you in return, how they had sought shelter with you during the winter storms. It said that locals had reported seeing the bears bringing you gifts, rocks and branches and even food. Most people were skeptical, calling it a tall tale, the kind of legend that grows in isolated places. But I know you, Dad. I know you've always had a way with animals that others don't understand." John paused, looking out at the forest, wondering who had been watching him, who had spread the story. Not that it mattered now. "The thing is, Dad, reading that article made me think about you in a way I haven't in a long time, about your connection to that place, to the wilderness. I've been so angry that you wouldn't leave, that you chose solitude over being close to me. But for the first time, I think I truly understand why that forest is part of you, just as Mom was, just as I am." Tears blurred John's vision, and he had to blink them away to continue reading. "I miss you, Dad. I miss our talks, our hikes, the way you taught me to read the forest like a book. If you're willing, I'd like to come stay with you for a few weeks this fall, to get to know you again, to see if we can find our way back to each other. Maybe you could even introduce me to your bear friends, though I'll understand if they're shy around strangers." The letter was signed simply, "All my love, Emily," with a phone number beneath. John sat on the porch for a long time, the letter clutched in his hand, watching as the afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the clearing behind him. Hanging on the wall just inside the door was the walking stick the mother bear had given him, a sacred keepsake, a testament to the extraordinary connection he had formed with a creature many would fear. And now, perhaps, a chance to form another connection, to rebuild the bond with his daughter that had frayed but never truly broken. John rose from his chair, his decision made. He would call Emily tonight, would tell her yes, would welcome her back into his life with open arms. There was so much he wanted to share with her, so many stories to tell. As he turned to go inside, a sound from the forest caught his attention, a soft growl, almost like a greeting. John smiled, raising a hand in acknowledgement to the unseen presence among the trees. "Thank you," he whispered, though he knew the bear couldn't understand his words. But perhaps she understood something deeper, something that transcended language, the gratitude in his heart, the joy that now filled his solitary existence. The forest whispered back, a gentle rustle of pine needles in the afternoon breeze. John Carter, retired forest ranger, once lonely cabin dweller, felt a peace settle over him that had been absent for far too long. Emily would be coming soon, the bears would return with the spring flowers, and John would be here, in this place that had shaped him, surrounded by connections both human and wild. No longer alone, he stepped inside his cabin, leaving the door open to the golden light of the setting sun, to the promise of tomorrow, to all the gifts the forest had yet to bestow.